Hello, protocols, packets, and programs. The Olympics are over, Black Hat and DEF CON are over, and I still don't know if Appsec is winning yet. Which means this week we chat with Kalyani Pawar about starting Appsec in a startup and how to make a big impact with a small team. Prepare for 2028 and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
It's the show to learn the latest tools and techniques to understand DevOps, applications, and the cloud. Your trusted source for the latest AppSec news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Imperva, a Thales company, is the cybersecurity leader that helps organizations protect critical applications, APIs, and data anywhere, at scale, and with the highest ROI. With an integrated approach combining edge, application security, and data security, Imperva protects companies through all stages of their digital journey. Imperva Threat Research and their global intelligence community enable Imperva to stay ahead of the threat landscape and seamlessly integrate the latest security, privacy, and compliance expertise into their solutions. Start a free trial today at securityweekly.com/Imperva. This is episode 295, recorded August 12th, 2024. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with John Kinsella. Hello, John.
Mr. Shima, I feel like I should have some sort of joke about like the Olympics of security happening in Vegas, but I'm all out today.
That's true. I think we missed your chance to rappel in from the top of the convention center. We'll work with your get you a contract for next year. But just so we know, Akira, we're here with Akira Brand as well. It's been a couple weeks. It's good to see you.
Hey, thanks. I'm glad to be back. I wonder if you caught the Celine Dion performance at the Olympics this year. Did a great job. Definitely check that out if you haven't already.
Great job. If you weren't moved by that song, then nothing will move you. It was a great performance indeed. And I don't know how to segue from Celine Dion to Disney, but let's try it. Short pause. You're invited to InfoSec World 2024 at Disney's Coronado Springs Resort in Lake Buena Vista, Florida. How's that for professionalism? It's from September 23rd through 25th. Save 25% by using our code ISW24-SW25 when you register at securityweekly.com/InfoSecWorld 2024. Kalyani Pawar is a seasoned AppSec expert with a deep passion for the startup ecosystem. She has extensive experience in designing security programs from the ground up for startups and advises early-stage application security startups on refining their products. Kalyani has shared her expertise at renowned conferences such as DEF CON, Day of Security, and others. She has been on the review board for DEF CON, GHC, YSIS, and several B-Sides chapters, helping shape their content to maximize their impact on the community. Hello, Kalyani. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, everyone. I'm happy to be here.
And we are very happy to have you here because we need you to help us make an impact on this particular 30 minutes or so segment about AppSec and startups. And I think this is something that John in the past has alluded to a couple times, but we've never really dived in on the idea that the needs for a startup are very different from many of the conversations we often have on the show, in the sense of, oh, here's a team of a few dozen people, here's a budget, where are you on the maturity model? These are not the things that people are worried about. So maybe that's the thing that we should start off with you, Kalyani. You're with a startup, you're advising the startup. Are they even thinking about security? How do you get that conversation started?
So most of the startups, unless their product is security, they don't really think security is the number one priority. If I were working at an MSSP, which I was in the past, they did care about secure coding, versus a bunch of other startups. It was not their number one priority, but almost it was in the list of priorities. Again, now it depends on what your application is, right? If I am a fintech startup, I really deeply care about PII. I really deeply care about security. But if I'm just like a note-taking application, that is not my area of concern, like, hey, it's just for taking notes. Well, who's going to steal what from me? You know what I mean? So yeah, security, it depends very much on what your startup is and what the focus is. And how big of a threat a certain cyber threat is. Now, it depends on legally how much you're bound by different jurisdiction, by different depending on the geography you're in, how bound you are by different laws. It again and puts an emphasis on how much security you want in your applications and how much you really care about it.
And part of that aspect too is you're already talking about the external factors that are influencing this. It's not like startups just say, maybe they do have an appreciation. Eventually, we need to know secure this, but I want to touch on maybe some of the things like where are you storing your data does maybe start to touch on architecture designs. Here's our geolocation, et cetera. Are there ways, if that's kind of one aspect of a external influence on a design, are there still subtle ways that you can influence design decisions at the beginning so that maybe future work doesn't become as hard, or you can start off secure or maybe more secure, just to use a relative term?
This is like one of my favorite things to talk about. I always give this analogy to people since I'm a baker. So I always talk about like baking, and I'm like, well, if you're baking a cake, do you add sugar at the very end or do you add sugar in the beginning itself when you're making the batter, right? And I think of security in a similar fashion. Like, hey, if you're going to release a really important feature, let us threat model it way before it hits production, right? I think it also depends very much. Sometimes I want to allude a little bit to like security culture, and it also depends on the engineering leader the org or the company or the startup has. How much, like we all want to build a secure product at the end of the day, but how secure do you want to get, right? And I think that pretty much comes also from top down. If you have an engineering leader who's like, I really deeply care about security, you have a very secure product. But then I've also come across some where they're like, well, I just need to be SOC 2 compliant, and like that's about it. So it depends on different attitudes that that the whole org can have towards security. But threat modeling always, it's like the cheapest resource a startup can have, right? When you're not thick in the finances, when you don't have the money that you can just squander away, not just like go around buying tools, which is the case at most banks, right? Or big tech. I think threat model is the most friendliest and cheapest resource that we have at hand, and there's so many resources available online, and it's a fun exercise if you do it with an application owner or with a bunch of developers. It gets a whole conversation going, like the whole brainstorming environment. We're all sitting in a room and we're nerding out on, hey, this is a feature, and hey, how can we like break into this, and hey, can we like secure this? How are we getting better, and things like that. But
is part of that, because there's one aspect you starting to talk about, the we, and I think on the we side of that, Appsec is possibly a team of one, pretty small. It's you. But I'm also curious. That does take time. It takes your time. It takes the developer's time. How do you figure out like what to threat model? Because you could sit down and have some long conversations about all the aspects of the application, but I have a suspicion that it's maybe about prioritization. It's maybe about like, what do we care about the most? Does that actually come from the threat model itself? Or is there another step? How are you getting that type of insight onto the application?
Sure. So in a very generic sense, when I'm like advising different startups about how they can start their Appsec program from scratch, one of the advices that I usually make is that you should have a set of security features that you're really chasing after. And if your dev is building any feature that is remotely related to this list, it has to go through a security review. It could be something like authentication service or authorization, or you're just building an API that's like dealing with the public internet or things like that, right? You're storing PIIs or something like that. It's very catered to the feature that you're building. But if you have a list ready beforehand, like, hey, if someone just goes like, hey, I'm storing all this data in this certain database. Well, is it sanitized enough? Is the database encrypted? You want to have that list, and you want to run it by the software dev organization, or at least the leads who fall within the organization. That hey, if you are building a feature that focuses on any of these target areas, let's just go ahead and threat model this feature. One thing I also suggest is that documentation is often a thankless job. I like to say that. And some startups, they do have like this onboarding documentation. And I suggest that it's good to have this list on the onboarding documentation too. So in terms of scalability, we're all aware that anyone new who's coming in and who's already in the team knows our specific areas of concern. That's one of my favorite ways to deal with the list of features and initiatives too.
So Kalyani, a lot of what you're describing, that idea of reviewing, and there is, that Notes app needs authentication. Most apps are going to need authentication. Are there ways that you approach this or can think about this so that you don't even set up from the very beginning that they need a review, meaning they need a review from you? Because that feels like potentially you're setting yourself up for burnout, despite clearly you're trying to do the right thing. Your heart's in the right place, but your brain is going to suffer after, only a few hours of sleep every day.
So I think I have a two-pronged answer to this. So I have been in a situation where there were like 200 developers and there were just like 2 or 3 Appsec professionals on the team at that time. And you're right. Like these 3 people, this 100:1 ratio is just it's not scalable, right? So there's 2 answers that you can do. Again, you don't have the best resources and the engineering hours to dedicate for this, but the first way to go about this is training. Again, that is something that very much depends on the skill set that the team has. I usually like to think about the ability that a developer has from getting from this point, say security knowledge level 0 to security knowledge level 2. I would still consider that a win. And I think one of the things that you could do is like just get a general sense of how much training needs to occur in order to get them to that point, right? It could start with, you could do like really simple things that you could send out surveys like, hey, do you know what XSS is? Or hey, do you know how your headers are referenced or things like that? And you can get a general sense of where the developers are at this point. And then you could start your training sessions from there. Now, I wouldn't suggest like making everyone sit in a classroom and then teach them like, hey, this is a plus b squared equals to a squared plus b squared plus 2ab. That's not fun. Instead, if you can have something that is interactive or where you can give like good examples of, hey, how we can exploit this certain thing. This is a certain class of vulnerabilities that we really need to watch out for. That would be one way to start off. The second thing is there are a bunch of like open source SaaS tools as well. Now, again, the problem here is that while you're saving on money, you're also dealing with like a bunch of false positives. Again, if you're just 3 of you, maybe it's not the best to like deal with this dragon of false positives at any given time. And nobody, like, I don't want to hate my job when I wake up in the morning, right? I want to wake up looking forward to it and solving all of these amazing issues. If you can identify the past mistakes that have been made by the developers, it could be something like bunch of buffer overflow. One of the things that I experienced in my career very early on was when I was doing manual source code reviews, I saw this one buffer overflow vulnerability, and I thought it just existed in one file. But when I looked for it, it existed in 8 other places, right? So they're not much educated on buffer overflow. So go after it, and then maybe you can also build a SaaS rule for it. So I would go with this 2-prong approach, just for starters.
So one of those aspects too of a small teams, startups, is that I wonder how much time and appetite do they have for that training versus can you just do this? Can you just do this? Because there is a lot of push, right? Just on the engineering team alone to deliver. You've got to hit this milestone. You've got to hit this sales milestone. You have to hit this feature for, that one company that says, well, we would purchase you, but you don't have this. So that feels like a tougher conversation to have. And do you find yourself then actually going in and being part of the coder? How does your role change in an appreciable way in response to that?
So I would, so there are obviously situations where there are other deadlines or priorities that a developer has to face. And the goal that an Appsec engineer should have at the end of the day is to make a product more secure. So if they don't have the bandwidth to do this, what I can do is I can go myself and make a few fixes to the code. For example, in the buffer overflow example, there was no check on the buffer, right? How difficult is it to just make a commit and correct that, right? And here's what happens in big tech is something I've noticed is if I notice this issue with the source code, I have to present an exploit. I have to present how the different ways that this can be exploited. And then I don't even have the permission to make changes to the code, right? Because it is owned by so many other people. And so what I have to do is I have to file a Jira ticket for the application owner team and be like, hey, this is what is wrong with your code. This is what the exploit looks like. If you have 15 minutes, I can show it to you. Then you show them the exploit, and then you make suggestions of how to fix the exploit. Whereas in a startup, all I can do is like, hey, let me just put a check in here and let me just push this code and it will just be tested and code reviewed and we're safer, right? So it's about the sense of responsibility and the freedom that you can practice at a startup versus at a big tech company, right? And things are usually slower in big tech versus at startup. And you have like these changing priorities everywhere. I'm sure big tech has those too. But with respect to startup, it's like really fast paced. You have to fail fast. You have to make mistakes faster. What although separates a good security culture versus a bad one is that do you have a blanket of failure? Do you have the freedom to fail enough, just enough that you can learn from your mistake and make changes to correct your mistake? I think that's something that again brings me down to security culture, which is it's just so fundamental. It's like it is there, but it's also not there.
So I have a question. You mentioned much earlier today about the impetus for having secure code needs to come from the top down. And that security culture also needs to come from the top down. But what can you do as an AppSec engineer to foster that message from the top down to the engineering leadership, to the VPs, to the devs, to the engineering managers, so that the message doesn't get lost in translation?
So I know that like whenever I hear this, the cliched answer I hear from everyone is that go with metrics, which is the obvious way, the most practical and logical way to deal with this is go with metrics. But also I think one important part that we're missing is that if we're not articulating our pain points, or if we're not telling our story the way it has to be told, you're leaving your audience, which is the leadership, to make their own inferences from the data, right? And so while I'm going with all of these metrics, I want to be mindful of what will cater to the leadership versus what will cater to me, and come to a middle ground from there. If you look at a product and you're like, hey, the PIIs are not sanitized, and you go with that information to the note-taking app, I don't think they're that much concerned. Versus at the fintech, they'll be like, oh, well, that's P0. Let me drop everything down and fix it, right? So it's the way you're telling your story. Metrics are great, and you can get all the amazing metrics that you can, but how are you able to tell your story? I think it also comes down to that. That is something you yourself can do to bring that culture from top down. And again, it's also like having multiple conversations. It's not an overnight change. We're trying to make that paradigm shift from very low security posture or almost no security posture to some security posture. It's culture. As humans, we're wired to be lazy, and so we're trying to take the easy way out. And so maybe having those conversations, putting the proper guardrails in place, it always helps.
I'm going to try and ask this question in the laziest way possible. But first, I'm going to tie these two together, Akira. I think part of what you asked, at least from my point of view, is if you're an AppSec engineer at a company, that means that they've blessed the budget to hire you and they care about security. So I think there's that storytelling that has to be part of the story. It's like, I'm here for a reason. But where I wanted to go is I'm always curious about earlier. I'm not going to I just did make a shift left joke, but when that company is younger, maybe seed or, pre-A, how we're not hiring AppSec people, right?
Yeah.
Unless it's like an AppSec startup. How do you get the company to start thinking about, really it's how do you get the founders to care about this a little bit earlier, maybe even just a month earlier than they would have before? Like, have you figured out any tricks to like how do you sort of, catch their attention and go, this is important. Like in 6 months, you're going to need a SOC 2, like instead of waiting till the last moment.
So in my experience working with pre-seed and seed, and they don't have budget for security, and outsourcing is not an option either, right? My favorite way to do this is, hey, you know what? XYZ company just got breached, and then they have to pay $1 million for this. And it's usually one of the competitors that, if it usually works best if it's one of the competitors that they have. And so it's like kind of like leading by example, like, hey, I know they made mistakes, and maybe we can learn from their mistakes and we can fix this while we have the time to fix it. And while there is no budget to do this, it very much depends on how much you care. Like it's your baby at the end of the day, right? And I'm usually talking to like engineering leaders, like VPs or CTOs, or sometimes CEOs in the pre-seed stage, because that's all that they have. And it's like, how much do you care about this, and how much risk this certain feature is going to have if you go ahead with it? And again, for that conversation to happen between me and them, there also has to be a certain awareness on their side, if I can put it that way. Not every pre-seed or seed cares about security. Like it's just how many I can count on my fingers who I have had conversations with. But again, like if your seed or pre-seed is a security product, you better
I've seen public security companies, you'd be surprised. But so, where was I going with that? I just totally lost my train of thought. Yeah, the point it's going to make there is like a lot of these founders tends to be very high appetite for risk. So that sort of plays into this too, right? It's like, it's yeah, that's important. And like, we need this and this to get done. But the founder mentality end of the day is like, well, there's 80 hours in a week, maybe 100 if I can push some people for a few weeks. Where do I fit that threat model into this?
Right.
And that's sort of the tricky.
It's tricky waters for sure. As an Appsec professional, over the years and with all the experience that you have, you develop like a compass to tell what is like a P0 threat versus what's like a P3 threat, right? If in your opinion, it seems like a P0 threat, the best you can do is tell them that this is wrong. It depends, again, if you're consulting or advising, it'll be best if you can get this on paper, because then you don't want them coming after you and be like, hey, you didn't tell me about this, because you did tell them about it, right? So if it is P0, absolutely make sure that they know the level of severity that this problem has. If they're okay taking the risk, and it's their product, there's only so much, you can only play an advisory role at the end of the day, and you cannot just like go and make changes to it right away, right? But over time, you develop that compass to understand what is an actual threat, what is an actual risk, versus something that can be delayed maybe even a year down the line. And when they have the resources to it, you can go fix it. But it does come down to the compass, in my opinion. And I've seen some professionals who are like absolutely paranoid, and paranoid to an extent where they'll be like, don't even use Zoom. I don't think we're making it easier for anyone if we say don't use Zoom, right? It's a risk I'm okay carrying. Yeah.
Yeah, and I wanted to follow up on that too, on that aspect, to help our listeners also understand, like you mentioned, like, is this a P0 risk or P1? Using language like severity or risk. Like, I don't care about nitpicking specific terms, but what I wanted to, like you mentioned cross-site scripting earlier. In my mind, there might be a cross-site scripting that will steal a cookie, but maybe it can't steal a cookie out of, a modern browser just because of other constraints. In other words, I'm kind of leading to the idea, do you still have to demonstrate an exploit when you're having this conversation with the founders? Or how do you have that conversation with the founders where you're talking about, this is the risk to the business, this is the risk of what's actually happening, rather than just this is number 2 and 3 on the OWASP top 10 list, and that just is bad by implication.
Yeah. So when we say, sometimes what I see in like very early on startups is it's not so much as a coding error as much as a business logic flaw. Like I can see that this business logic is not logicking. Math is not mathing. And I think to kind of tackle that problem, I usually like to talk about things like the likelihood of this happening, or how much are we going to lose if this actually gets exploited, or how easy, again, right? How easy is this exploit to do, right? If 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 me as a user, if I can see what an admin is doing, that's absolutely bizarre. That, like, let's not ship this ever. It's okay if we hire like more people. I would rather hire more security focused people here than shipping something like that, right? So it also comes down to having that conversation about how likely it is that this can be exploited. Again, when I say exploited, I'm not talking about like an exploit per se, but more like the business logic. Like, this does not make sense. Like, maybe we need to add 1 or 2 guardrails more. Usually, it's maybe 10 engineering hours that it can take them to apply this fix, and that's easier. That bargain is much easier to do versus saying something like, let me make an exploit and let me see how I can exploit this, and then let's put a fix for it. Because you're not always at the liberty to do that. Everybody has like time constraints, right?
I like that, because what you're doing there is you're starting to instill that idea of, hey, let's do the right thing, or but you're doing it in a way which it's going to affect the business, but you're sort of priming them to start thinking more about security later.
Yes. Exactly. Yeah. When we talk about this, like, especially in startups, it's like we talk about security culture and it's like we're talking about UFOs. You know what I mean? Like, hey, like, we probably know UFOs exist, but we don't have pictures of it, or it's all like blurry, and that's what security culture is. And I would always say, like, as an Appsec individual,
I do want to believe. Yes, thank you.
That's great.
It's your responsibility to come up with metrics for this. It should be one of your goals to understand where you are and how you can possibly mold this into a better shape or form, right? And it happens a lot at like very early stage startups, more than you can imagine. Especially in the Valley, I come across so many startups, and I'm like, how have you raised so much funding? I don't believe it.
So Kalyani, one of the things that I'm always curious about too is you're talking about spending time, the engineering hours on fixing vulns, severities, etc. There's also, in my ideal world, I know we don't necessarily live there, but we would avoid so many vulns in the first place. When you're having those conversations about the direction and design or architecture, I'm going to use those big words about the application. Every application pretty much needs an authentication. Are you able to have those conversations about, let's use this login with Google, login with Apple, the OAuth, OIDC types of authentication, passkey, just because I love that, versus, well, engineers are just driving ahead. And the reason I'm asking this is that it feels like at a startup, you have a lot more greenfield opportunities to just, quote unquote, do something right. Or maybe, let's say, do something more secure from the beginning. What kind of success have you had there? Or tell us a bit about how those conversations have gone, because a lot of what you're talking about is conversations with engineering leadership.
Yeah. So I usually like to answer this with something I read in a book a couple of years ago about psychology. Every behavior is a product of motivation, ability, and cue, your prompt, right? Motivation is how motivated you as in terms of Appsec, how motivated are you to secure your product, or how much is it a priority for Appsec, for the leadership, right? That's motivation. Ability is where am I today and where I want to go in a year, 5 years, or how you want your product to look at a given time. Last one is prompt, which is mostly like what has happened externally that has made you think about this. Is it like a customer who's like, I want you to, I would really like it if you have a SOC 2 in place, or at least planning for it. Or it could be something like, hey, this is a popular package and this 0-day vulnerability out there and it's all getting exploited and things like that, right? So it's a combination of all of these things that helps you mold your behavior towards security. Since since that's what we're talking about, or in life in general, right? And so I like to have my conversations mostly in terms of like, and the three things that I spoke about, like, hey, this is where we stand today, and this is where I want to go. So, and one of the easiest things to pick on, outside of the authentication, is the behavior, right? Is the behavior towards how seriously we're going to take an architecture. And again, like, it's not an overnight change. It takes so many months sometimes to drive it through, and yet you're not happy. But hey, at least one secure step, one secure step at a time. That's how I like to put it.
So one of the things you're describing there is more about emerging properties of culture, because it's not culture that's driven by metrics. And I don't think that's what you intended, because if we drive it by metrics, it becomes gamification, becomes people just say, well, these are the metrics that we're optimizing for. That's not our culture. So maybe as we try to wrap up our conversation here, how would you wrap up a conversation with one of these engineering leaders at a small startup? They've, pre-seed, seed rounds. They just need to do a market fit. They got to prove this, but security needs to be on their mind. So, with that setup, possibly that impossible setup, help us out.
So sometimes, and I've done this once, and it has worked wonders for me, was we're having all of these conversations, and sometimes everybody's plate is full at a given time. And so it's not easy for you to decide what your priority is at a given moment. And so I can play the role of a helper, a helping hand. But sometimes there's only so much help that you can do. So usually I try not to follow a prescriptive approach to security, like, hey, I ran this cannon and there's 10,000 findings, and like, hey, go fix these top 10. That's not the metrics that we're going after, right? But instead, what I have seen effective is, learning by doing. If I was able to successfully show that, hey, as an outsider, I could break into your application and this is what I can find. And this is me as an outsider. This is like a friendly hacker. You can call it a friendly hacker. If I can do this, I'm pretty sure there's other people out there who would be able to do this, right? Who are more skilled than I am. And I think when you do something and you have something to show for that, it always helps. Because it's it gives a certain sense of urgency. It creates a certain sense of hey, this is real and this is an actual threat, versus me just going hey, these are the metrics and this is wrong, and then let's go fix it. And so I think that has been one really interesting conversation I've had in the entirety of my career. I was just a consultant trying to work on something. And they were like, hey, I don't think this is a threat. And I'm like, let me show you how it is a threat.
Yeah, they can either have you show them, or, it pops up on one of the news sites that says, oh, by the way, this site just lost a breach for blah, blah, blah. And, you can have that conversation with the engineering leader. Repeat after me. We take security seriously, blah, blah, blah. This is what that blog post becomes, right?
Yeah.
So
and
then maybe
also, what? What I like is if you're on the same page with an engineering leader, and then you can always play this good cop, bad cop kind of a setting where they can be the good cop and they can have these conversations with their team, or you could be the bad cop and you're like, hey, this is wrong. I could exploit this. Maybe it's time we fix this. So yeah, it's just a fun anecdote I like to give people. Yeah.
Well, we've definitely had a lot of fun with you, Kalyani. You've given us a lot of good ideas, good thoughts on talking to engineers during early stage startups, especially. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to thank Akira and John as well, and thank all of our listeners. No news segment this week. Instead, stick around for 2 micro interviews from Black Hat. And as always, remember to subscribe, share on the socials, check out the show notes. And speaking of code, check out Visions of Rust by Alpha Chrome Yayo. We'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.